The storm hit so fast I didn't have time to think, just react. I'd been hiking the backside of Shady Valley for 3 hours, following a dotted line on an old topo map I'd picked up at a flea market in Bristol. The trail was barely there, just a suggestion of a path worn by animals in time, but I'd been desperate for something real. Something away from the interstate and the gas stations and the constant hum of other people's lives. The sky went from a hazy mountain blue to a bruised purple in less than 10 minutes. The kind of shift that makes the hair on your arms stand up before the first raindrop even falls. I felt it in my gut first. That primal recognition of weather that means business. The wind picked up sudden, tearing through the hemlocks and beeches like they were paper. And the first fat drops started hitting the leaves around me with a sound like someone throwing gravel. I had no shelter, no tent, no tarp, just a pack with a water bottle and a flashlight I'd forgotten to pack fresh batteries for. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of a few heartbeats. I was starting to panic when I saw it through the trees, a shape that didn't quite fit the natural lines of the ridge. A cabin, or what was left of one. It sat in a small clearing that was more mud than grass, the structure tilting toward the downhill side like it had been slowly trying to lay itself to rest for decades. The porch was a wreck. The boards buckled and slick with wet rot and years of falling leaves. Moss and vine had claimed the railing, pulling it down into the earth in slow increments. The roof had caved in over what might have been a front room once. But the main structure was still standing, just barely, like an old man stubbornly refusing to fall. The door was gone, just a dark rectangle leading into the gloom. I didn't hesitate. The rain was starting to come down in earnest now, cold needles on my neck, and that dark rectangle promised something better than being out here when the lightning started. I ducked inside, and the smell hit me first. Old wood, wet earth, and something else underneath it, something sharp and mineral that I couldn't name. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed and quiet for too long. The floor was a mess of broken glass and wet leaves. The remnants of a window someone had shattered years ago. The walls were just studs now. The plank siding rotted away in patches, but the roof over this room was mostly intact. A fireplace stood against the far wall, its hearth crumbling and blackened with ancient soot. The whole place was maybe 15 feet by 15, just a single room that had once served as someone's entire world. I stood there dripping, catching my breath. And that's when I noticed the floor. Right in the center of the room, almost invisible under the debris, was a door. Not a trapdoor, not a cellar hatch like you'd see on a farmhouse. This was a proper door, built into the floorboards, with rusted iron hinges, and a heavy ring pull that looked deliberate, purposeful. It was the only thing in the room that still seemed solid, still seemed cared for. The wood around it was worn smooth where hands had gripped it, and the iron ring was almost clean, polished by use. It didn't belong in a place this broken. I told myself it was a storm cellar, a root cellar. Every old cabin had one, a place to keep potatoes and preserves through the winter. It made sense. I was 100 yards from a collapsed structure. The rain was starting to lash through the gaps in the wall. In a place like that would be dry, sheltered. I could wait out the worst of it down there, maybe find an old jar of something to keep me warm. It was a rational thought. I was a rational man. I'd driven down from Ohio. A long weekend of solitude in the mountains. Just me and the trees and the quiet. I wanted to be alone. I'd gotten my wish. I grabbed the ring and pulled, and the door swung up on hinges that didn't make a sound, perfectly oiled, perfectly maintained. Cold air rushed up from the opening, stale and damp, carrying that same sharp mineral smell I'd noticed before, stronger now, layered with something else that made my stomach turn. Sweet decay, like the aftermath of a gut wound in a deer, old wet stone, and beneath it all a faint metallic tang like rust and old pennies. I fumbled in my pack for my lighter, clicked it on, and held it down into the dark. The flame guttered in the draft, but I saw enough. A dirt floor about 8 feet down. Walls of rough stone, the kind that had been stacked by hand generations ago. and in the center of that floor, I bolted to a massive limestone block, a single rusted chain. The links were thick, the kind you'd use to anchor a boat, and they ended in a heavy iron cuff, wide open, like a jaw that had been pried apart and never closed. It was empty. The lighter flickered and I pulled it back, snapping the door shut. The sound it made was final, a heavy thump that seemed to echo in the room. My rational mind was still trying to catch up, still trying to put together a story that made sense. Maybe it was an old hunting shack. Maybe the chain was for hanging meat, for keeping bears out of the kill. The cuff didn't make sense for that, but maybe it was just rusted. The shape distorted by age. I told myself that. I told myself a lot of things. I dragged a broken chair over to the fireplace, propped it against the wall so I could sit with my back to something solid. I pointed myself toward that door. I was going to keep an eye on it, just in case. Just until the rain passed. I didn't want to go down there. That was fine. I didn't have to. I don't remember falling asleep. I remember sitting in that broken chair, the rain drumming a mad rhythm on the tin roof, the sound of it drowning out everything else. I remember watching that iron ring, watching it catch the weak gray light filtering through the gaps in the walls. And then it was dark. Not just gray, but true dark, the kind that presses against your eyes. The rain had stopped. And the silence that followed was thick and wrong, like the whole mountain was holding its breath. I was cold, colder than I should have been. My lighter was on the floor. I dropped it at some point. I was too stiff to reach for it, and that's when I heard it. A soft, wet scrape coming from directly in front of me. Something heavy being dragged across damp earth. Slow, deliberate, one scrape, then a pause. Another scrape, then a pause. It was coming from under the floor, under the door. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just stared into that black rectangle where the ring should have been, and I watched as the iron began to tremble. Vibrating against the floorboards like a plucked string. Tiny at first, then stronger, the sound of metal against wood, a chattering that rattled up through my bones, then the voice. It came up through the cracks around the door, thin and reedy like a child trying to whisper through a mouthful of mud. The words were slow, spaced out, like the speaker had forgotten how to form them. Let me in. A long pause, and then, it's cold down here. The voice wasn't pleading. It was just stating a fact, like the air had decided to speak. But the tone of it, the thinness of it, made something cold slip down my spine and settle in my gut. That wasn't a child. It sounded like a child, but it wasn't. The vowels were wrong, too flat, too old. It was the sound of something that had learned to mimic human speech from a distance, without ever quite understanding how it worked. I pressed myself back into the chair, my hand over my mouth, trying to quiet my own breathing. The ring stopped trembling. The door was still closed, but I could feel it in the air. A shift, a pressure change, like the whole room had exhaled. And then the ring began to lift, slow, so slow. The door creaked, hinges screaming against decades of rust, and it rose an inch. Then two. The darkness beneath it wasn't just dark, it was solid. I like looking into a pool of black ink. And out of that ink, curling around the edge of the door, a finger. It was pale, so pale it seemed to glow in the gloom. And it was long, far too long, segmented like a spider's leg. The knuckles were wrong, too many of them, bending in directions they shouldn't. The nail was thick and yellow, curved like a talon, and it scraped against the wood with a sound like a chisel on stone. It gripped the edge of the door, and I saw more of the hand, the skin stretched tight over bones that looked brittle, ancient. The door lifted another inch, and another, and I saw it, just a sliver, a pale wedge of a face. A single dark eye rolling in its socket, searching the room. It didn't see me, not yet. But it was looking. It was looking right at the spot where I'd been sitting. I moved without thinking. My body took over. The primal part of me that knows what to do when the shadow in the corner proves it can move. I threw myself sideways, out of the chair, and hit the broken window frame in 2 steps. Glass bit into my palms, but I didn't feel it. Not then. I scrambled through the opening and fell into the wet grass, my hands sinking into the mud. The rain was starting again. a cold drizzle that felt like salvation. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I pushed myself up and ran, my boots slipping on the wet leaves, my lungs burning with the cold air. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs. Until the only thing I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the thunder of blood in my ears. I crashed through branches and stumbled over roots, and when I finally stopped, bent over with my hands on my knees, I turned around. The cabin was just a dark smudge in the trees, lost in the mist and the rain. I couldn't even tell which direction I'd come from. The mountain had swallowed it, but I knew it was still there. I knew that door was still open. And whatever had been waiting in that cold, dark place was not waiting anymore. I've been back to those mountains twice since then, trying to find that cabin, trying to prove to myself I hadn't imagined it. I never found it. The trail is gone, the topo map is useless, but sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and I'm just drifting off, I hear that soft, wet scrape and that thin, reedy voice asking if I'm cold. Asking if I remember the way back. I do, I remember every step, and I pray I never find it again. My grandfather had a saying, one he'd repeat whenever we'd pass an old foundation in the woods or a chimney standing alone in a field. The mountains don't bury their secrets, boy. They just let them grow over. I was 27 when I finally understood what he meant. I'd come down from Knoxville with nothing but a duffel bag and a desperate need to get away from the noise of my own life. The divorce had gone through in the spring. And the city felt like it was closing in on me. Every street the same, every face a reminder of what I'd lost. I'd spent my childhood summers in these hills, hiking with my grandfather, learning the names of the trees and the habits of the deer, and something in me knew that the mountains were the only place I'd find any peace. I'd been driving for 3 hours, following a 2-lane blacktop that got narrower and narrower until it turned to gravel, then to dirt, and then to nothing at all. I was about to turn back when I saw the gap in the trees. A break in the rhododendron thicket that looked like it might lead somewhere. I parked the truck and walked in, and that's when I found the homestead. It sat at the bottom of a steep hollow. I tucked into the fold of the mountain like it had grown there, like the land had pushed it up from the soil. The house was a 2-story frame structure, weathered gray, with a tin roof that had held up better than most places I'd seen. The porch sagged a little, but the steps were solid, and the windows, though filmed with years of dust, were intact. A root cellar stood off to the side, its door propped open with a rock, and from what I could see, it was dry inside, the stone walls still holding strong. I walked around the property, my boots crunching on the dry leaves, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Quiet. Not just the absence of sound, but a deep, settled quiet, the kind that feels like the land itself is breathing slow and easy. The trees leaned in over the holler, their branches interlocking high above, filtering the light into a soft green gloom. I could hear water somewhere, a creek running down from the ridge, and the sound of it was like a balm on my raw nerves. I knew, standing there in that clearing, that I'd found my place. The deed was technically in dispute. The county clerk had told me that much when I'd called. The owner, an old man named Silas, had passed the winter before, and the will was tied up in probate. But the clerk had also said, with a wink in her voice, that nobody was likely to bother me if I just stayed quiet and kept my head down. That was all I needed to hear. I started cleaning the place up that first day, sweeping out the years of dust and dead leaves, patching the holes in the screens, hauling out the broken furniture that had been left to rot. The work felt good, felt right, like I was putting something back together that had been waiting for me. I slept on the floor that first night, a sleeping bag spread out in the front room, and I woke with the sun coming through the trees, feeling more rested than I had in years. I made coffee on a little camp stove and sat on the porch, watching the mist rise off the hollow, and I thought about how lucky I was, how this place had just fallen into my lap when I needed it most. I didn't think about the garden until the second day. I'd been walking the property line, trying to get a sense of the boundaries, when I came across it. It was overgrown, of course, choked with brambles and weeds, and the insistent creep of wild blackberries. But there was something about it that stopped me cold. The soil was black, not just dark, but black, a deep, rich, almost oily black that looked like it had been fed and nurtured for generations. I could smell it from the porch, 20 feet away, a dark, fecund smell that hit me like a physical presence. It smelled like life, like the earth itself was breathing, like something had been feeding that soil for a very long time. I stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. I felt a strange pull, a desire to touch it, to dig my hands into that black loam and feel it between my fingers. It was a compulsion almost, a need that I couldn't quite explain. I started working the garden that afternoon. It felt wrong to let it go to waste, I told myself. A garden that rich, that well-tended, it deserved to be brought back to life. I spent hours pulling weeds, cutting back the brambles, turning the soil with a shovel I'd found in the root cellar. The work was hard, but it felt good, felt righteous, like I was honoring something, continuing a tradition that had been broken. The black soil was soft and easy to work. And the smell of it filled my head, sweet and dark and somehow alive. I didn't notice the time passing. I didn't notice the way the shadows lengthened or the way the birds went quiet. I just kept digging, kept turning. I kept preparing the beds for the seeds I didn't yet have, and then my shovel hit something solid. A dull clang that vibrated up through the handle and into my palms. I stopped, my heart suddenly beating faster. I knelt down and scraped away the loose soil, my fingers digging into that black earth, and I found a boot. A leather boot, cracked and stained with age, the leather gone dark and stiff. I pulled at it, and it came loose with a wet sound, and that's when I saw what was inside. A bone, a long one, white and smooth, connected to another bone, connected to a pelvis. I dropped the boot and scrambled backward, falling onto the damp ground, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I'd found a person. A whole person, or what was left of one. I sat there, my hands covered in that black soil, and I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The sun was going down, and the hollow was growing dark, and I felt like I was being watched. I didn't call the police. Something told me not to. Something told me that if I brought outsiders into this hollow, I'd be inviting something worse than the law. I covered the boot back up with soil, tamping it down with my hands, and I went inside. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the front room with a kerosene lamp, watching the shadows shift on the walls, and I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it. It was an old boot, an old bone from an animal. It could have been anything. It didn't have to be a person. But I knew in my gut that it was. I knew I'd found something that was never meant to be found. The next morning, I went looking for answers. I searched the house top to bottom, going through every drawer, every trunk, every forgotten corner. I found the journal in Silas's bedroom, hidden under a loose floorboard, wrapped in oilcloth like it was something precious. The cover was worn and stained, and the pages were yellow with age, the handwriting shaky and cramped. I sat down on the edge of the bed and started to read. It was a record of decades, entries written in fits and starts, documenting the seasons, the weather, the slow decay of the house. But it was the last entry that stopped my heart. It was dated the spring before Silas died, and the handwriting was barely legible, the letters trailing off like he'd been too weak to hold the pen. She's been in the ground long enough, it read. The rhododendrons are ready for a new bed. There was no more, just that one line, written in a hand that was already halfway to the grave. I closed the journal and sat there for a long time, my mind racing. He was talking about a woman who'd been in the ground, a woman he'd put there, and now the rhododendrons were ready. I thought about the garden, about that rich black soil, about the boot I'd found. I thought about how good the earth had felt under my hands, how right it had felt to be there, turning that soil. I thought about the compulsion I'd felt, the pull that had drawn me to that garden, that had made me want to dig. I looked out the window at the plot of land, at the dark earth gleaming in the afternoon light, and I knew, with a cold certainty that settled in my bones like ice, that I wasn't the first squatter to stay in this house, and I wasn't the first one to try to tend that garden. The soil didn't get that rich by accident. It got that way because it had been fed, over and over, year after year, body after body. Silas had been growing something in that garden, something that needed that black, fecund earth to thrive. And now he was gone. I and the garden was waiting. I packed my bag that night, throwing my things into the duffel with shaking hands. I was going to leave, drive back to Knoxville, and never think about this place again. But I stopped at the door, my hand on the frame, and I looked back at the garden. The moon was full and bright, silvering the leaves, and I could see the soil shining in the darkness, slick and wet, and I felt it again. That pull, that need, that deep, primal urge to go back out there and finish what I'd started. I told myself to run. I told myself to get in the truck and drive until I couldn't see this hollow anymore. But I didn't. I walked back to the garden. I picked up the shovel, and I started digging. I don't know how long I was out there. I don't remember making the decision. All I know is that at some point, the sun came up over the ridge. I was standing in a hole up to my knees, the black earth caked on my arms and my face. I'd found more, a hand, a rib cage, a skull with dark sockets that seemed to stare up at me in the early morning light. I climbed out of the hole, my legs shaking, and I walked to the house. I found the phone in the kitchen, the old rotary that Silas had kept on the wall, and I called the police. I told them what I'd found. I told them everything. They came with their trucks and their lights, and they dug up the rest of the garden. They found 6 bodies in total, 6 people who'd come to this hollow looking for something, just like me. 6 people who'd stayed too long. But they didn't arrest me. They couldn't. I hadn't killed anyone, I'd only dug them up. They asked me a lot of questions, and I answered them as best I could, but my mind was elsewhere. I was standing on the porch, looking at the garden, and I was thinking about that journal entry. The rhododendrons are ready for a new bed. He'd been planning to plant someone that spring, but he died first, and now the garden was waiting. I didn't tell the police that part. I didn't tell them about the pull, the compulsion, the way the soil had called to me. They wouldn't have understood. They wouldn't have believed me. But I knew. I knew that if I stayed in that hollow, if I slept in that house one more night, I'd be out there in the morning, shovel in hand, planting something new. I drove away and never went back. But sometimes, late at night, I still smell it. That dark fecund smell, the earth breathing. And I know it's still there, waiting for the next one. The next person to find that homestead, to feel that pull, to take up that shovel. The rhododendrons are ready for a new bed. And they'll keep on being ready, season after season, until someone plants them. I just hope, whoever it is, they're strong enough to walk away. I wasn't. I only got lucky. The mountain let me go. But it doesn't always. My friend Leo was always chasing the ghosts. Not the kind that rattle chains or throw furniture, but the ones that live in the spaces between stories. The ones that old-timers tell in low voices when they think no one is listening. He'd been running a podcast for 2 years, something he called Appalachian Echoes, and he'd built up a small but dedicated following of people who shared his obsession with the strange and the unexplained. He'd covered everything from the moon-eyed people of the Cherokee to the Bell Witch, but his true obsession was the Hanging Dog Hollow. It was a place I'd never heard of until Leo started talking about it. A deep, narrow cut in the mountains up near the North Carolina line. A place where the signal was supposedly so strong you could pick up voices from the past on a standard AM radio. He'd been planning this trip for months. Reading every account he could find, talking to anyone who'd ever spent a night in that hollow. He was convinced that Hanging Dog was a thin place, a spot where the veil between then and now was worn ragged. And he wanted to capture it on tape for his season finale. I thought it was a load of crap. I told him that. I told him the stories were just stories, the kind of thing people tell to scare children and tourists. But Leo had that look in his eye, that feverish gleam that I'd seen before, and I knew there was no talking him out of it. So I agreed to go, not because I believed, but because I was his friend. I didn't want him going into those mountains alone. We drove up on a Friday afternoon, the sky a hazy blue that promised good weather. The road twisted and turned, climbing higher into the hills, and the trees grew thicker, I closing in on us until the light was dim and green. Leo had a map, a topo that was older than both of us, and he navigated us onto a logging road that was barely more than a pair of ruts. We parked the truck at the end of it and hiked the last mile, our packs heavy with equipment. The hollow was exactly what the name suggested. A long, steep-sided valley that dropped away from the ridge like a wound in the earth. The trees were old here, massive oaks and hemlocks that blocked out most of the sky, and the air was cool and damp, smelling of leaf mold and standing water. At the bottom of the hollow, we found the lodge. It wasn't much to look at, just a collapsed hunting cabin, the roof caved in, the walls leaning at odd angles. The porch was still intact, though, a narrow platform of weathered boards that overlooked the dark heart of the hollow. Leo was thrilled. This is perfect, he said, setting down his pack. This is where they heard it. Right here. I didn't see anything perfect about it. The place felt wrong, like the hollow itself was holding its breath, watching us. I shook off the feeling and started helping Leo set up his equipment. He had a portable recorder, a couple of microphones, and an old AM radio that he'd modified with a long wire antenna. I strung the antenna up in the rafters of the porch and connected it to the radio, and we sat down to wait. As the sun began to drop behind the ridge, the temperature plummeted. I pulled on my jacket and zipped it up. But I couldn't stop shivering. The wind picked up, moaning through the rafters, and it carried a sound with it, a low crackle that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Leo leaned forward, his eyes bright with anticipation. Listen, he whispered. That's it, that's the carrier wave. I listened, and I heard it too. A hiss of static like the sound of rain on a tin roof, but sharper, more electric. It was coming from the radio. But it was also coming from the air itself, a faint buzzing that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. Leo adjusted the dials, trying to tune it in, and the static began to shift, to pulse. It was almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Then the sound started to form, to coalesce out of the noise. Not voices exactly, but the semblance of voices. I heard a laugh, a woman's laugh, high and bright, coming from somewhere deep in the static. Then a lullaby, a soft, humming melody that I almost recognized, a tune from somewhere far away and long ago. And beneath it all, the creak of a rocking chair, slow and steady, like someone was sitting on the porch of that collapsed lodge. Watching the sun go down. Leo was ecstatic. He was leaning into the radio, his eyes wide, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "This is it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This is what I came for." But he wasn't looking at the recording equipment. He was staring past it, into the dark heart of the hollow. I followed his gaze, and I felt the blood drain from my face. There was nothing there. Just shadow and trees, and the deepening blue of the twilight. But I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach lurch, that the sound was coming from a single point in the darkness, a point where the shadows were deeper, more solid, like they'd congealed into something that had mass and weight. The singing stopped, the laughter faded, the rocking chair went still, and then a voice, clear as a bell, cut through the silence. It wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the hollow, from that point of deeper dark. "You have to come inside," it said. "The rain is coming." I felt the hair stand up on the back of my neck. The voice was pleasant, almost kind. The voice of a woman who was concerned for our welfare. But there was something wrong with it, something I couldn't quite place. It was too clear, too pure. Like it had been stripped of all the little imperfections that make a voice human. And it was coming from the dark, from the nothing. Leo stood up, his eyes still fixed on that spot. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "It's her." It's the woman from the stories. She wants us to come inside." I grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into his sleeve. "Leo, no," I said. "There's nothing there. It's a trick, an echo, something." He shook me off. His face lit with a feverish excitement. "It's not a trick," he said. "It's real. She's real. I have to go." I have to see. The sky split open with a crack of lightning and the rain came down in a rush. A solid sheet of water that seemed to fall all at once. I was soaked in seconds, my clothes clinging to my skin, the cold shocking me out of my paralysis. Leo took a step toward the hollow, then another. "Wait," I shouted. "Leo, wait." But he didn't wait. He walked down the steps of the porch, his boots splashing in the mud, and he walked into the dark. I stood there frozen, the rain pounding down around me. I wanted to follow him. I wanted to grab him and drag him back, but I couldn't move. My legs were made of lead, my arms pinned to my sides. I watched him walk toward point of deeper dark, and I watched the shadows swallow him up, and then he was gone. Just like that. The rain was coming down harder now, and the wind was howling, and I couldn't see anything beyond the edge of the porch. I turned and ran. I don't remember getting to the truck. I don't remember starting the engine or driving up that logging road. I just remember the rain and the cold and the sound of my own breathing, ragged and desperate. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I drove down the mountain, the tires sliding on the wet gravel, and I kept driving until I reached the main road. I didn't stop to call anyone. I didn't stop to think. I just drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. The headlights cutting a pale tunnel through the dark. And then the radio in my truck crackled to life. I didn't have it on. I hadn't turned it on since we'd left Knoxville. But it was on now, and it was playing static, a low hiss that filled the cab. I reached for the dial to turn it off, but my hand froze in midair. A voice came through the speakers. Leo's voice, or something using it. "Mark," it said, "why did you leave me?" I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "It's so cold out here," the voice continued, "and the rain, it's getting in." The voice was Leo's, but it wasn't. The cadence was wrong, the emphasis off, like a recording played at the wrong speed. It was the same voice I'd heard in the hollow, the voice that had told us to come inside. "I can see you, Mark," it said. "Why are you driving away? It's safe in here, it's warm." I slammed my hand against the radio, trying to turn it off, but the knob just spun, useless. The voice kept talking, kept asking me why I'd left, kept telling me how cold it was, how the rain was getting in, how it wanted me to come back. I drove faster, the speedometer climbing, the road blurring past in the rain. I drove until the radio went silent, until the only sound was the engine and the tires on the wet asphalt. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I couldn't. I told myself it was grief, the shock of losing my friend, the stress of the situation. I told myself Leo had gotten lost, that he'd wandered off in the rain, that he'd turn up eventually. But he never did. They searched that hollow for weeks, combing every inch of it, but they never found a trace. No footprints, no equipment, nothing. Just an empty hunting lodge and a silence that seemed to press in from all sides. I tried to go back once, a year later. I drove up to the hollow, parked my truck at the end of the logging road, and walked to the edge of the trees. I stood there for a long time, looking into the dark, and I heard it. A voice, Leo's voice, calling my name, telling me to come inside. I turned and walked away. I never listened to his podcast again. I never told anyone the whole story. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I hear the static, and I hear Leo's voice asking me why I left him. And I don't have an answer. I only know that something took him that night. Something that was wearing a voice that sounded like a friend, and that it's still out there, waiting in the Hanging Dog Hollow, waiting for the next person to come looking for ghosts. It found what it was looking for in Leo. It found a believer. And I think that's what it wants. Someone who believes, someone who'll follow the voice into the dark, someone who won't run.